Welcome, everyone. This is the first WMS Acquisitions Best Practices session, and we thought we would start with this series with setting up a budget, since you'll need to complete this task in order to start using acquisitions for ordering and invoicing. So the first and most important thing in setting up your budget is to take time to plan. The planning phase really should take a lot longer than the time it will take you to actually enter the budget in WMS, because there are several important considerations that you'll need to think about and document as you make your decisions. Keep in mind, once you create the budget, you cannot delete it. So we do not suggest creating a test budget in your WMS instance. Instead, with some careful planning, you should be able to successfully create your first budget and then start using it for actual transactions. We'll go over each of these considerations in the planning process in some detail. We suggest creating a planning document or spreadsheet of your decisions. Next, using your planning document or spreadsheet, you'll create your first budget in acquisitions. Then before you start using your budget, it would be a good idea to download the budget as you've entered it, to review it and make any necessary changes, since once you start using the budget, there are some things that cannot be changed. When you're ready, you can then start using your budget for ordering and invoicing in acquisitions. So in planning your budget, these are the main decisions you'll want to make and document. You'll first want to decide on start and end dates for your budget period and the duration of your budget, which can be 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years. Next, you'll want to consider how you want to structure your budget, meaning how you want to use the fund levels. You also need to decide on fund names, fund codes, and fund statuses, and finally, the amounts that you want to budget for each of your funds. So to get started, let's talk about the start and end dates for your budget. If you want to start using acquisitions at the beginning of your next fiscal year, for example, for us fiscal year 24, you can simply enter the start date as the first day of the fiscal year and then select your budget period. 1 year is most common, but you can also select 6 months or 2 years. Then the end date will automatically populate based on your start date and the budget period that you select. So in this example, let's say I want to start using acquisitions at the beginning of the next fiscal year. So I set my start date to the first day of the upcoming fiscal year, July 1st. I left the budget period set at the default of 1 year. And then the end date is automatically populated for June 30th, 2024, based on my start date and the budget period or duration. On the other hand, if you want to start using acquisitions sometime in the middle of your fiscal year or sometime during your fiscal year, you have a few options for your first budget. So option 1 would be to predate your start date to the beginning of the current fiscal year, but enter budgeted amounts based on the remaining balance of funds in your current system. Remember, if you plan to move over any open orders from your old system to WMS, these may already be counted against your remaining balance in your old system. So if you want your budgeted amounts to be accurate, you'll want to add these back to the budgeted amount in WMS. So in this example, I've predated the start date to the first day of the current fiscal year, July 1st, 2022. I've also left the period set to 1 year, so my end date would be 1 year from the start date, or June 30th, 2023. Option 2 for a mid-fiscal year start date, you could set your start date to sometime during the fiscal year and enter budgeted amounts based on the remaining balance of funds in your current system. So I have 2 examples here. For example, you could predate the start date to a mid-fiscal year start. So I have here January 1st, 23, and then make it a shorter budget period. So I made it 6 months. Then you'd be able to start next year's budget with the actual beginning of the fiscal year, July 1st, and make it a 1-year budget if you wanted to do that. The second option here would be to set the start date to any date. So for example, set it to today's date, March 1st, 2023, and then also select a 6-month budget period. Now this is going to make your end date 6 months from today, or August 31st, 2023. However, you can adjust the end date to the end of the fiscal year, That would be June 30th, 2023, after creating the budget. Then you also would be able to start next year's budget with the beginning of the fiscal year, July 1st, and make it a one-year budget. Finally, option 3 for a mid-fiscal year start would be to choose one of the two options we just described here, but to set your budgeted amount to be the full amount for the year and create dummy invoices charging for what's expended and create order items for open encumbrances. For your budget structure, you can create up to 5 levels of funds. Now, there's a few things to understand about the fund levels. First, only the top level fund is required. Second, third, fourth, and fifth level funds are optional. A second level fund is a child to its top level fund. Third level fund is a child to its second level fund, and so on. And you would see on the budget and acquisitions, these are indented under their parent funds. You may choose to have only top level funds, or you may choose to make your top level funds container funds for their child funds. In other words, you wouldn't add a budgeted amount for the top level container fund, but would divide the top level amount among its child funds. Also, funds at all levels can be selected for an item on an order or invoice unless you set the fund status to disabled. So for the fund status, you can choose 3 different options here. This will determine if the fund can be used on an order or invoice. So you can set your funds at any level to enabled, which is the default, disabled for new transactions. This excludes order or invoice items that use the fund before you set the status. And then finally, the newest option is disabled for all uses. Now, if you decide to set your budget up using top-level funds as container funds, you should set these to disabled for all uses as you're creating the budget so they're not accidentally selected on orders and invoices. In the next few slides, I want to show you some of the complexities of the budget fund levels. Now, you don't necessarily need to know all of these details when you're setting up your budget, but it would be helpful to understand these details as you go forward in the fiscal year and you're reviewing your funds and your remaining balances. So first of all, the budgeted column would be the amount you allocate to that specific fund. And the total fund budget column equals the sum of the parent and all the child budgeted amounts. So in this example, I have my budget set up with just 2 top-level funds, books and DVDs. And they each have second-level child funds under them. The top-level books fund also has 1 second-level child fund, Books Children's, which has its own child fund, a third-level fund, Books Preschool. So I've budgeted 0 to my top-level fund, Books and DVDs, since I'm using them as container funds. But notice that the total fund budget for the Books Fund is $2,600, which is the sum of its budgeted amount, 0, and all its child funds. That is the second and third level funds under it. For the top level fund DVDs, the total fund budget is $1,000, which is the sum of its 2 child funds, DVDs Academic and DVDs Leisure. Notice also that the second level fund, Books Children's, has a budgeted amount itself of $600, but its total budgeted amount is $700, which is the sum of that $600 and the budgeted amount of $100 for its child fund, Books Preschool. And here I've added a column for the total remaining balance and a column for the remaining balance. So the remaining balance equals the budgeted amount minus the encumbered and expended amounts. Remember, you encumber funds when an order is placed and expend funds when an invoice is paid. And then the total remaining balance equals the remaining balance for a fund plus the remaining balance of its child funds. So the total remaining balance for the top level books fund in this example is $2,500, which is the sum of the last column, the remaining balances for that fund and all its child funds. And finally, it's important to understand that it is the remaining balance of a budgeted amount for a fund that is used for new transactions. So when you select a fund to use for a transaction, The amount can only come from that fund and not from a parent fund. So a child fund cannot debit money from a parent fund in a transaction. So in this example, if you choose Books Preschool Fund on an order and its budgeted amount of $100 has been expended, so its remaining balance is zero, the amount on the order will not automatically debit the parent fund, Books Children's, even though it has a remaining balance of $600. So instead, it will deduct it from the fund that you've chosen, Books Preschool, and this would result in a negative remaining balance. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about fund names. So as you're deciding on fund names, keep in mind that in the budget, funds are listed alphabetically by top-level fund name and then alphabetically by second-level name and so on. On orders and invoices, all levels display alphabetically by fund name regardless of the fund level. So it would be best to avoid using the same name for different funds. If you use the same fund name for more than one fund, it doesn't seem to be a problem distinguishing them when viewing the budget, which you see here on the left, since the funds are listed in the hierarchy and are alphabetical by top level and then by second level and so on. For example, a second level fund under the Books Fund here is called Monographs, and there's also a second level fund called Monographs under the parent fund, Law. However, when selecting a fund on an order or invoice, as you see on the right side here, it may be hard to distinguish these funds since they're not listed by the fund hierarchy, but are listed alphabetically by fund name regardless of the fund level. So a solution to this might be to precede the fund name Monographs by its parent fund name, Books and Law. So you would call them Books Monographs and Law Monographs. And then when selecting a fund on an order or invoice, there'd be no problem in distinguishing which is which and possibly selecting the wrong fund. Fund codes must be unique for that budget. So you have some options here. Some suggestions might be to use a shortened form of the fund name, maybe use the identifier used by your institution's financial system, or maybe use a combination of the above. Keep in mind that the fund code serves as a primary match point when creating a new budget for mapping transactions over to the next budget. So after going through the planning process, considering all that we've talked about so far, you can enter your budget in WMS Acquisitions. Remember that planning your budget is really 90% of the work you'll need to do. And once you've done that, entering your budget in WMS is really the easiest part of this. We recommend documenting all the decisions you've made regarding fund names, fund codes, fund levels, and budgeted amounts on a spreadsheet or some other document before you start entering your budget in WMS. A few things to keep in mind. The budget is created when you save the first fund. And once you create the budget, it cannot be deleted. However, you can add funds, you can delete funds not yet used, meaning once you use a fund for an order or an invoice, the fund cannot be deleted. You can edit budgeted amounts. You can also transfer amounts to different funds. You can change fund names, fund codes, and fund statuses. So to start entering your budget and acquisitions, you would log into WMS and select Acquisitions, of course. And then on the left navigation panel, select Budgets, and then select New Budget. So the first thing you'll need to select is your budget start date and your budget period. So by default, the period is going to be set to 1 year, and the start date will be populated with today's date. So to change the start date, you'd click on the calendar widget, and then from the pop-up calendar, I'm going to select here July 1st, 2023, the first day of my upcoming fiscal year. And as soon as you click on the date in the calendar, it will be populated as the start date. If you make an error, you can just click the calendar widget again and you can go back and change it. So now my start date is set to July 1st, 2023, the beginning of the fiscal 23-24 year. And I'm going to leave the period set to 1 year, so my end date is now June 30th, 2024. Note that the state for the budget says New. Now that's going to change to Current, and my budget will be created as soon as I add my first fund. So below the budget period, you'll see the columns for the fund name, fund code, and so on. To add my first fund, I'll click Actions with the green circle under it there on the far right. And then I see the Add New Fund screen. So let's say I've decided to use my top-level funds as container funds, and I'm going to have second-level funds under them. So I've entered my first top-level fund name, Art, for the fund name. The fund code, I'll just enter an A. For the fund status, I've selected Disabled for all uses. Since, as I said, this is a top-level fund I'm going to use as a container fund. And also for this reason, I'll leave the budgeted amount set to 0, and then I'll click on Save. So note now that the budget state has now changed to current, and since this is my first budget, it's automatically enabled. Now to enter a second level fund under the Art Fund, I'll click on the ellipsis on the far right side of this top level fund. And then from the drop down, I click on Add. And on the Add New Fund screen, I've entered the fund name for my second level fund as Art Monographs. I've assigned a fund code, A123. I've left the fund status at the default enabled since I want to use this for transactions, and I've entered a budgeted amount of $2,000. And then I'll click on Save. And now I could continue adding second level funds under Art or a third level fund under the Art Monograph second level fund. To enter a child fund, you just click the ellipsis on the far right side of that fund, or I could do that after entering my other top-level funds. So to enter another top-level fund, I would just click Actions again with the green circle under it on the far right side of the header row. And then I'll enter the fund name, history, fund code H. I've selected the fund status again, disabled for all uses, since again, this is my second top-level container fund. And I've entered 0 for the budgeted amount, and then I'd click Save. To add a second level fund under the top level history fund, I'll click the ellipsis at the end of the history fund, and then I would click Add from the drop down. And here I'll add the fund name History Monographs, fund code H123. I'll leave the fund status as enabled, and for the budgeted amount, I've entered $1,000, then I'll click on Save. So I'd continue adding funds in this way until I've finished adding all of my funds and budgeted amounts as I had planned, using my planning document to guide me as I go. Once you're finished entering your budget, we recommend that you download it to do one final check on your fund names, fund codes, and budgeted amounts. First, though, you want to make sure that you expand all fund levels. And you can do this by clicking on the top triangle on the left of the column header. You also want to make sure that you've selected Show All Columns. Remember, you can always delete columns that you don't need to see once you've downloaded it to the spreadsheet. So to show all columns, first click on the Configure button on the far right side of the budget screen, and then click All if it's not already selected. Finally, click the download icon on the top left side of the budget screen. And then your budget will be exported to a CSV file. Now you can start using your budget, selecting the funds you've created on orders and invoices. It should be helpful that when you select or hover over the fund in the drop-down on an order or invoice, you'll be able to see the budgeted amount for the fund as well as the current encumbered, expended, and remaining balance for that fund. When you place an order, the amounts will move from the remaining balance for the fund to the encumbered amount for that fund. And when you pay an invoice, the amount will move to the expended amount for the fund that you've chosen.
If you have questions, please go to help.oclc.org and click Contact OCLC Support for contact information in your region.